Hello everybody. Today I'm assigning this is April 30th. So, like you've been doing on all the assignments, if you could put something from history that was important that happened on April 30th and a famous birthday for someone born on April 30th. Hope you guys are making some progress on your Oklahoma history biography. Um, you might note by the name of the slideshow today that we're going to be just kind of hitting a few things here and there. This is lots of stuff. So it's not from one chapter. That's why, as we're nearing the end, this is kind of how this happens every year. Although if we'd have been in class, we'd probably gotten a little bit further along by now, but not too much. But by the end of the year, um, I never intend to cover some of the later chapters because they just don't tell us a whole lot about Oklahoma itself. But I'm going to pick some of the things. So we're going to look at some of the early statehood of Oklahoma today and get to the 1921 Tulsa race riot as well. And that's what we'll be covering today. So as we do this, let's begin talking about our first state legislature. For the most part, obviously, this was during the Progressive era. So they begin to meet, and this does mean that they believe the government is best qualified to make the changes in society. So they really make use of government programs quite a bit. They begin to make, public education a priority. They also um, begin to establish higher education as well through colleges. But one of the things I did want to mention, and this is done early on in Oklahoma history, is discrimination. Um, Now, in a court case in 1896, very famous court case, I don't have it on here, but I'm going to have you answer it in a question, so be ready to write this down. The Supreme Court, the case was Plessy, Plessy v. Ferguson, Ferguson. So Plessy v. Ferguson. It said that you could have segregation. Now, what this court case said in the Supreme Court of the United States was that if you had separate but equal facilities, you could have white and black facilities. Now, segregation is wrong, period. And even at that, segregation was never done this way. Separate but equal was not typically the case. They might have separate, but the white bathrooms were typically nicer. The white um, areas and restaurants were typically nicer. So they weren't equal. There might have been some separation there, but there certainly wasn't equality. Well, one of the major problems that crops up during this time period, and this isn't even in resulting in segregation, is trying to keep blacks from voting, which was a way of desegregation. And these things were all deemed unconstitutional, but they still were done regardless. But two ways that this was, well, there were three ways this was done, but the two I'm going to mention that were done in Oklahoma at some point in time or another was something called a grandfather clause. This clause said you can vote if you had an ancestor who could vote in the 1860 election. Well, no blacks had an ancestor who could vote in the 1860 election. So that kept blacks from voting in some areas. Also, in some areas in Oklahoma and other parts of the United States, they would require you to take a literacy test. Could you read the state's constitution? If you could take the test. If you couldn't take the test. Now, you might be like, well, that could actually affect whites as well. Well, the problem is they didn't give whites the same testing. And sadly, at this point in time, blacks still were, I'm not going to say, there were quite a few blacks who could read, but they still were more illiterate than whites because they hadn't received the amount of education as whites. So the goal there, once again, was to keep blacks from voting. Interestingly, in the second legislature, as they do some voting, Republican A.C. Hamlin, who was an African American from Guthrie, was elected as the first African American to serve in the state House of Representatives, and he was a Republican. Once again, Republicans were the ones supporting blacks, not Democrats during this time period in history. In fact, in 1908, this happened in 1908, Democrats blamed the new Republican strength on black voters. And so they wanted to keep blacks from voting because they felt blacks could help the Republicans. Also, a part of politics was moving the capital. Okay, so the original capital was in Guthrie, and so and in the original Constitution, it said it was supposed to stay there for 13 years. But because Guthrie was primarily a Republican area of the state, and the Democrats controlled the government in early Oklahoma history and for much of the early parts of Oklahoma history, they wanted to move the capital to another area. Guthrie protested this in the courts, but the capital was moved to Oklahoma City well before the 13 years were up. And so the moving of the capital in Oklahoma was a political move. That was what it was primarily about. So, like I said, I'm just trying to move along pretty quickly. Let's talk about Jim Thorpe real quick. It is during this time period that you start getting automobiles. So that's going to be a pretty big deal, and it's going to play a big part in this next part too when we talk about oil. I'm not going to read the whole thing about Jim Thorpe, but Jim Thorpe was a Cherokee Indian, a natural athlete. He did track and field, football, baseball, lacrosse. He was in the Olympics. He won gold medals. He had them stripped from him because it was deemed that he had played professional baseball before being in the Olympics, where he won the pentathlon and the decathlon in the same Olympics. That's 15 different events. That means he was in. Now, they eventually did restore his medals to him, but this was after he's dead. They restored him to his family later on in life because back then he didn't play for like the Yankees or some major team like that. He played for some podunk team, but he did get paid to play, so they deemed that to be he's a professional athlete. Which at this point in time in history, to be an Olympic athlete, you had to be an amateur, not a professional. I said, and that's still primarily the case today, but not for like basketball and hockey. Those are people are getting play. So things have changed since then. But he played college football, and then he went to play pro football in the early history of the NFL. He was a defensive back. In fact, if you win the greatest if in college football, if you get the award for the best defensive back of the year in all of college football, it's called the Jim Thorpe Award. In fact, King Gustav V of Sweden at the 1912 Olympics told this to Thorpe. He said, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." And so Jim Thorpe, incredible athlete, incredibly gifted. I know at least one or two of you guys were going to do your bio on him. A good one to choose. Definitely a lot of good stuff there. So this is when oil becomes important. Sometimes it was called black gold because it's valuable like gold. The first successful commercial oil well in Oklahoma, or it was the Nellie Johnstone #1 in Bartlesville. We talked about that like first 2 weeks of class. During this time period, for a brief time, but around 1904, Tulsa became known as the oil capital of the world. Glenpool was the first major oil field in Oklahoma. And you're like, but Nellie Johnstone that was the first commercially successful, but it wasn't major. It didn't last for like years and years and years, whereas the Glenpool was a major oil field. This was discovered in 1905. It also was deemed to have better quality oil, which needed less refining as well. So that was pretty important. The Glenpool oil field brought in more money than the California gold rush and Colorado silver rush combined. So very important. Cushing Field became the nation's largest oil source for 8 years. At its peak in May of 1915, it was producing 300,000 barrels a day. So obviously, Cushing is still called the pipeline crossroads of the world because of the oil pipelines and natural gas pipelines that are there. So oil played a huge role in Oklahoma history during this time period. And obviously, it plays a huge role today. And in Bartlesville, it's a huge part of our history. Like I said, it's during this time period too that you had automobiles. You had the beginning of building of roads and the automobile industry, which made oil even more valuable than it was before. So we're now going to look at a terrible moment in Oklahoma history, which is the Tulsa race riot. Now, let's say this first. This is the largest race riot in U.S. history. Okay, so we're not talking about a small riot. We're talking about the largest one in U.S. history. So this is a very significant event. Now, I don't have a lot up here, but I'm going to talk a pretty good amount about it. So please write down relevant information to help you. Well, this all begins sometime after 4 p.m. on May 30th, 1921. Dick Rowland, who's up here, he was a black shoe shiner, so he worked in a business. This is during a time period of segregation, so there were black bathrooms, and the only bathroom he could use was in a different building, and it was on the top floor. Other buildings didn't have bathrooms that he could use. So he went to that building, which was the Drexel building, a little after 4 p.m. on May 30th, 1921. He got in the elevator where Sarah Page, a 17-year-old white girl, was the operator of the elevator. Back then, they had people who operated the elevator for people. The two likely knew each other, at least by sight. This was the only bathroom he could use, and she worked in the elevator before this. It's not like this is the first time they would have saw each other. Now, this does not mean they knew each other. There are some. Now, I'm sharing this because there are people who believe possibly they had a romantic connection, which would have been totally taboo and potentially dangerous during this time to be a black and a white who liked each other. But like I said, that is complete rumor. There's no basis for fact on that. Because some people say maybe what happened here was an argument. But here's what we know, because we don't know a lot. What we know is Dick Rowland goes in the elevator, and either on his way up or on the way down, a store clerk who's on the bottom floor hears a girl scream in the elevator. He starts going towards the elevator, sees a young black man running away from the elevator, comes in and finds Sarah Page in the elevator. He thought she had been assaulted, and he summoned the authorities. Now, it is unusual that both these two would be working on Memorial Day, because this was Memorial Day. Most places were closed, but we still don't know exactly the circumstances around that. Although the police likely questioned Sarah Page, we don't know because we don't have the records. They didn't keep any written record of her of what her account was. It's generally accepted that the police determined that what would happen was two teenagers was less than an assault. In fact, authorities felt it probably was something accidental, and this is what most people believe, is Dick Rowland was getting in the elevator, tripped and fell, put his arm on Sarah Page. She screamed. He then, realizing the situation of blacks, unfortunately, in Tulsa during this time period, that that'd be kind of scary. So he ran out of the elevator. So they decided to do a low-key investigation. The police did, instead of launching a manhunt, because they didn't feel there was anything major. And a very important factor, Sarah Page told the police she would not press any charges, meaning most likely nothing important occurred. If it ended there, we'd be good. It's like, okay, well then, good, nothing happened. Well, on the morning after the incident, so now we're on May 31st, Detective Harry Carmichael and Henry Seapack, a black patrolman working for the Tulsa police, arrested Rowland and detained him. Now, when we say arrested, they just wanted to bring him in for questioning. So they initially took him to the Tulsa City Jail. Later in the day, however, they got an anonymous phone call threatening Rowland's life, and they ordered him to a more secure jail. So they took him to the top floor of the Tulsa County Courthouse. At this point in time, this is pretty normal procedure. Things still don't seem like they're going to get out of control. However, the Tulsa Tribune, one of two white-owned newspapers in Tulsa, broke the afternoon story with the headline, and I'm reading the headline, so, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator," describing the alleged incident. According to some witnesses in the same edition of the Tribune, there was an editorial warning calling for a potential lynching of Rowland. It said, quote, "To lynch Negro tonight." Remember, I'm sharing those words because that's the quote from the newspaper. Now, the newspaper was known to have a sensationalist style, so they weren't always noted for their accuracy, and they did try to give splashy headlines to really get people to read. Now, you might be like, you said in the same edition, it's reported that maybe, well, there's no original copies of this newspaper, and the relevant page from the microfilm, which talked about the lynching, is not in the microfilm copy of the paper. So uh, it's possible that wasn't in the paper, but the fact that it's missing from the microfilm seems to show that this newspaper did kind of call for a lynching. The afternoon edition of the Tribune hit the streets after 3 p.m. Soon news spread of potential lynching by 4 p.m. Local authorities were on alert. White residents began congregating at or near the Tulsa County Courthouse. By sunset that day, several hundred white residents assembled outside the courthouse, and it appeared to have the makings of a lynch mob. There had been lynchings in Tulsa before this. They weren't always the black people, though. In 1920, a white man who was suspected of murder was lynched. But the new sheriff is determined not to let the lynching happen. So he took steps to ensure Dick Rowland's safety. He puts a defensive formation around Rowland. He puts 6 men armed with rifles and shotguns on the roof of the courthouse. He disabled the building's elevator. And then the remaining men were put at the top of the staircases with their guns ready. And he told them to shoot at any intruder on sight. So the sheriff then went outside after setting up these defenses to try to talk the crowd into going home. If they had gone home, once again, things would not have happened. But the crowd did not disperse. A few blocks away in Greenwood Avenue, members of the black community gathered and discussed the situation. They determined Rowland might be at risk, so many black residents were determined to prevent the crowd from lynching Rowland. However, they were divided upon how to do this. Young World War I veterans were prepared to go to battle. They began collecting guns and ammunition. Older, more prosperous men feared the destructive confrontation would likely cost them dearly, and they felt like, well, we don't want to arm ourselves. That will be bad. Now, I should have said this first, but let's briefly pause. We'll get to this here in a second and continue the story. Green was an especially successful business district for black businesses. In fact, it was nicknamed the Black Wall Street of America. Okay, so these blacks are meeting in this area, and this was really a good place for blacks to live in this particular area in Tulsa. Okay, now we'll get back to the story. Having seen the armed men, some of the more than 1,000 whites, the group of blacks showed up about 9:30 p.m., 50 to 60 of them armed with rifles and shotguns. They arrived to support the sheriff and offered their help to the sheriff and the deputies. He said, I don't really need your help defending Rowland. However, there were, some 1,000 white men who were there at this point in time, and they saw these armed black men show up. So many of them, not all of them, but many of them went to get their guns. Some of them went to try to raid the National Guard armory, but the National Guard was already on alert, and they were defending the armory. They went guns from there. You get a little bit later into the night. Now we're talking, 11 p.m. ish or so. About 2,000 people were now armed. A Presbyterian minister arrived to try to dissuade the mob and tried to get them to disperse. The police chief once again tried to call for them to go home. Blacks still worried about the safety of Rowland. Many armed black men began driving around in automobiles near the courthouse. They were really doing reconnaissance and demonstrating they were prepared in case action was necessary, but many white men interpreted these actions as an uprising and became concerned. Eyewitnesses reported gunshots presumably fired into the air, increasing in frequency as you get later into the evening. Rumors began to fly that whites were going to storm the courthouse. So a second larger group of approximately 75 armed black men descended onto the courthouse, and they offered their support to the sheriff, who once again declined their help. According to witnesses, a white man was alleged to have told one of the armed black men to surrender his pistol. The man refused, and shots were fired. The first shot may have been accidental. It may have been meant as a warning. However, when the first shot was fired, more shots were then fired. The initial chaos only was a few seconds, but it did leave a few people dead 10 whites and 2 black were dead in the initial shooting here on the steps. Panic set in as the white mob began firing on any black people in the crowd. So the blacks fled back into Greenwood and fled away from the courthouse. Around a little after 11 p.m., numbers of National Guard units began to assemble in the armory to organize a plan to subdue the rioters. Several groups deployed downtown to guard the courthouse, police station, and other public areas as well. Around midnight, white rioters assembled outside the courthouse again, in a smaller group this time, but more determined, and they shouted in support of a lynching. Now, in the early hours of the next morning, we're talking about very early hours, armed whites and blacks continued to square off in gunfights. White rioters threw lighted oil rags into several buildings and began to have the fires. So around 1 a.m., a white mob began setting fires to commercial businesses in the Greenwood district. The Tulsa Fire Department showed up, but they were, whites waiting there at gunpoint, told them to go away. As news traveled among Greenwood's residents in the early morning hours, many began to take up arms in defense of their neighborhood. Others began the mass exodus from the city. The next day, Oklahoma National Guard arrived with about 109 troops from Oklahoma City by special train at 9:15 a.m. They're not supposed to take legal action, however, until they have all the authorities have come in and said that they can take action, and they eventually do. They do quite a few arrests, and they mostly arrest blacks. Unfortunately, even the police departments, which probably weren't as racist as some of the other parts of society, they still were somewhat racist, so they tended to support the whites in this particular issue. There were some innocents who were killed too, coming out of a movie theater late at night as the riot was going on. Now, I put down here at the bottom riot or massacre. Up until literally this year, this has always said Tulsa Race Riot. And in your book, it's listed as a Tulsa Race Riot. And that's what I had always reported it as. However, as I was looking it up, some more information on it recently, some of the places have changed the name from riot to massacre. And I think both names have merit. Primarily the blacks here are innocent, and that makes you think massacre. And I say primarily they are innocent. They are. However, there were some blacks that showed up armed, and that makes it look more like a riot. So I'm saying you could debate on whether it's a riot or a massacre. But certainly the toll it has on the black community is much larger than it is on the white community, especially in the loss of property. Now, I say that because loss of life, sorry, I don't even have the book in front of me. I've been given notes from something else. I'm trying to see what number they give in the book for deaths. 100 to 300, probably closer to 100. The 300 is an insane number that pretty much no one can support. Now, I say that we have no clue how many people died, and I mean no clue. So let's look at the reports right after this. So on June 1st, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune reported that 9 white people and 68 black people had died. Okay, so that would be 77. Shortly afterwards, the same paper changed it to 176. Wow. The next day, they reported 9 whites and 21 black people. So the same newspaper varied from 30 to 176 in a 3-day period. The Los Angeles Express, 2-day period. The Los Angeles Express headline said 175 were killed. The New York Times said 77 had been killed and that 68 were black, but it lowered the number to 33 later on. Other newspapers did similar things. Oklahoma Department of Vital Statistics count put the number of deaths at 36, 26 black and 10 white. Very few people, if any, died as a direct result of fire. Current estimates by people who know what they're doing, who've studied this a great deal, estimate that the deaths are probably somewhere between 75 to 100. I said your book says 100 to 300, but that any number above 100 actually seems pretty high. This still is the deadliest race riot or race massacre, whatever you want to call it, in U.S. history, regardless of the numbers, whether they're 75 or 100, is still the largest. And like I said, one of the worst parts actually is really the loss of property. It's in the back in that money back then, millions upon millions of dollars. 10,000 blacks were homeless in Tulsa after this because of the fires that were set ablaze to their homes and to their businesses. Some of the businesses rebuilt. This was part of what we were going to do on our trip. This was going to be our last stop. Was going to be Greenwood, and they have some little plaques along the. They're in the cement. I wouldn't say plaques maybe, but they're kind of like a plaque, but it's a little thing in the cement in the Greenwood area, and it talks about what business was there, whether it was rebuilt or not. So some did, but some did not. Many moved from Tulsa and left Tulsa. Obviously, it wasn't that safe of an area to be. So one of the worst parts of Oklahoma history would be the Tulsa race riot, and just unfortunately a part of the past of the United States of America. Now, if we were in class, I would say let's discuss. How is racism? Is there still racism today? How has it changed? What's better? And obviously, I think racism is much better today. There are still people who are racists. I mean, there's always going to be. Unfortunately, we're never going to have a world where there's no racism. Um, However, it's important to understand racism can go both ways. Um, uh, I wish we could say we could live in a world where there isn't racism, but that is not the case. However, the good news is we no longer see segregation like we once saw. We no longer see the things happened here um, with any regularity at all, and it's not really happening anymore. So we have seen a lot of positives in race relations in the United States, but events like this are why tensions were high for quite some time in U.S. history. So I actually don't have another question today because normally at the end, I ask you a question, but today, just finish up your notes, get those handed in to me, continue working on your Oklahoma biography. Remember the first page and all your sources are due by this Saturday. So signing off. Hope you guys are doing well. Bye.